people's attention, but I'm glad to see everyone is awake, smiling. Now, my name is Nerida, as written in the program Nthamburi. I come from Kenya, born and brought up in Nairobi, which is my homeland. But I've also lived, so I'm sort of also a migrant. I've also lived in other parts of Africa, specifically in South Africa, for about 3.5 years, and I also worked and lived in Uganda for quite a while, almost 5 years. My background, I am a lawyer, but I don't practice, so my background is more in the social justice sector. So I've worked for over 10 years in the human rights sector around Africa. Africa is my passion, and most of my work has been on human rights defenders. So I guess my interaction with migration, as I was telling Nunu, okay, I don't know what's happening. Slow down. Oh, I slowed down, sorry. Nairobi girls tend to talk very fast. The reason is because we get into a lot of trouble with our mothers, and so you have to talk fast. You probably get yourself out of trouble. So I will slow down, I apologize for that. So I was saying, so my interaction with migration was from a human rights defender's point of view. So we worked a lot on forced migration, especially issues of human rights defenders at risk around the Horn of Africa. So we worked a lot with human rights defenders from Eritrea, Sudan, Somalia, Kenya, and tried to sort of meet whatever needs they had, and also from a policy level, worked to find out why are human rights defenders, especially coming from my background, why are human rights defenders, I will slow down, I am very sorry. So going to what Nunu asked me to speak about. I'm going to speak a bit about gender and why gender is very important for all of us here. We're talking about migration issues, and especially from a policy point of view, why gender this, why gender that. And we keep hearing, especially in Kenya, and most East African countries right now, and I'm sure other countries, we need to take into account gender. And so I'm here just to give a very brief overview of what we should be looking at from a gender perspective. So I'll ask us to put on our gender spectacles, on our gender lenses on, and see what issues, when we're dealing with migration from a policy point of view, should we be thinking about, and what issues that probably have not been talked about that we should be thinking about. I like that Collins, I think in 1.5, when he was giving his 7-point overview, point 5 really talks about women and migration and what issues, and children, what issues we should talk about. And maybe picking up from that, to mention gender is not only women. When people talk about gender, everyone assumes, oh, he's talking about women. No, gender is men and women. And I'll probably start with giving a definition. What's the legal, international definition of gender, and how does this apply to us? So gender is a term that's used to describe socially constructed roles for women and men that are socially learned and that can change over time. And these roles can also vary across different cultures. Now that's a very long description. Just to break it down, an example, for example, in Saudi Arabia, women are not allowed to drive. This is not because of their sex. So now sex refers to the biological and physiological differences between men and women. So you can see how gender roles will vary from culture to culture. In Kenya, women can drive. In Saudi Arabia, women are not allowed to drive because of the social constructed rules that define that a man is supposed to do this, a woman is supposed to do this. So, as I said again, gender does not only refer to women, it is both men and women when we're talking about gender constructs and gender roles. And most importantly for us also over here as we're talking, I want to reiterate the fact that gender is intersectional. This means that it does not imply that all men and women are alike. So they should not be treated as generic, or all men, when we're talking about male migrants and women migrants. They're all different, because there are certain categories that we need to talk about and we need to highlight. For example, race, ethnicity, minority status, marital status, socioeconomic status, religion. These are intervening factors when we're talking about migrants, and we're talking about gender, when we're looking at what are the gender specificities when we're dealing with certain groups, for example, of people. Also to point out, gender does affect, and it also reinforces vulnerabilities and differences with relation to certain differences such as race or ethnicity, class, marital status, and all this that I've mentioned. Which basically what I'm saying is you get a migrant that is a female from Somalia and she's Muslim. How does the receiving country treat her differently from a migrant that is male and from Greece, and his ethnicity is white? So you sort of see the differences in which policies do need to take into account gender and other different structural issues. So what issues then should we look at as we're sitting here? What issues from a policy level should we look at with a gender lens? Now the gender lens is pretty much just putting all issues that could come up from a gender perspective into account. So one of them, I've listed 5, these are just examples. You guys are the experts, you know what to look at. So I'm just giving an example just to sort of jog our memories or try and stimulate our discussions later. When we're talking about the admission and post-admission procedures in countries of destination, do their policies, for example, do they take into account different gender dimensions? Do they take account different ethnicity dimensions, for example? That's one thing we can ask. And then also when we're talking about discrimination, so there are policies that target certain genders, that discriminate against certain genders. I'll give an example. In Israel, a report was carried out, I think was carried in a New York daily just late last year, in which the Israeli government apparently was forcing certain immigrants, especially from Ethiopia and Eritrea, to take contraceptives. Females are being forced to take contraceptives in a bid to keep the population down. So for example, that's a discrimination. That's institutionalized discrimination already. Then thirdly, it's a fact that most female migrants are actually involved in temporary labor migration, domestic workers and so on. So some of these some of these jobs, for example, do carry a high degree of vulnerability to abuse and exploitation. So how can we then reach out to policies or influence policies to address this particular vulnerability? And then we'll also talk about issues such as the right to family life, especially when we're talking about female migrants, and fair remuneration, barriers that do attract more women into highly skilled sectors, for example, and issues such as employment statistics. So I'll just also go very quickly. I know my time is almost over. So what is the risk of not engendering policy? And I just wanted to point out issues such as issues to do with engendering policy. What do we talk about? What is this engendering policy? Engendering policy is pretty much mainstreaming the process of gender within whatever policies that we're coming up with. And this is a process of assessing what implications are for both men and women and children in any planned action. This will include legislation, will include policies, will include international conventions and treaties, etc. So there are 3 very critical entry points that we can use to critically influence this policy. But so I'll just name them very quickly, and we'll talk about them later, hopefully tomorrow. So we'll have commitment from the top level. This means if you're looking at policy at the UN level, what bodies are you reaching out to? Are you reaching out to the ILO? Are you reaching out to whatever UN bodies that have been set up for this? At a national level or at a regional level, are you reaching out to AU, IGAD, in the SADC region, for example? And at a country level, like Kenya, or yes, I will slow down, thank you. At a country level, like Kenya, you'll also reach out to government officials, you'll reach out to labor officials, for example, and try and get this commitment from a very top level. Hand in hand with this, you reach out to certain stakeholders. Now the stakeholders are the people who are, I like to call the entry points, your entry points. It's very rare that any of us will ever meet a president, but I think it's much easier, for example, to meet a minister or a permanent secretary in a ministry and try and really get their commitment and their support. So these are heads of government departments who implement issues in public authorities. And then something that we can also, because there's a lot of international migration, we also have embassies in our countries and reach out to the heads of these embassies, the heads of these diplomatic missions, and use them to try and influence their countries back home. And then thirdly, there are also enabling mechanisms such as budgeting. Can we get involved in the budget processes in our own countries in an effort to ensure that policies are engendered, immigration policies are engendered. And in this, we work with experts to estimate the costs of engendering policies. For example, can we have more officers or gender officer in certain ministries or in certain departments, something like that. So one of the risks of not engendering policies, just listed four, there are very many, you can go into hundreds. So if you don't engender policy or we don't talk about gender, then what are the risks we run into? So first of all, we continue the cycles of poverty. There's institutionalized discrimination that will continue, no one is addressing it. Then we have issues of sexual and gender-based violence targeted at both male and female, and impunity. And if no one is dealing with that or the root causes of this, then really it will keep happening. And we also have lack of access to remedies for issues that immigrants face, and who do they go to, who do they talk to. So as a start, I think you guys would know best, but there are certain, the current legal framework, very, very briefly, I'll just go over that, and I'm closing in 2 minutes exactly. So there are a number of international legal instruments that you can already use that have already recognized that policies need to be engendered and that certain policies need to be, policies need to be put in place at a national level. So some of these are, of course, the ILO Conventions on Migrant Workers, and most importantly, I'll just highlight the ILO Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work, and the Multilateral Framework on Labor Migration, which contains beautiful and amazing language on gender. And maybe if we can use some of these things to influence our own policies at home. And then, of course, picking up from the CEDAW, that's the Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Violence Against Women, which actually carries out, which has specific language against suppression of all forms of trafficking in women and exploitation in prostitution of women, for example. And then we have the different UN International Convention on the Protection and the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of the Family, borrowing from the European Convention as well on Human Rights, which has a bit on that. So in a summary, what I'm just really trying to say is the importance of gender in our policies. Let's not forget about that. Let's look at it. But it goes hand in hand with other issues that we want to talk about during these 2 days. And then let's not reinvent the wheel is something I also wanted to bring about. Some of these policies and issues that are raised are already contained in certain instruments. And it's up to us to then adopt them for our own settings, our own African settings, our own individual country settings, and try to really work with policymakers and with people who work at the grassroots to try and implement and actualize these issues. So thank you very much for your time.